The silk caught fire faster than I expected. One moment, I was standing in the doorway of Margaret's pristine living room, my wedding dress draped carefully over my arms like a sleeping child. And the next moment, those ivory layers were disappearing into orange tongues of flame that danced with an almost celebratory fervor in the marble fireplace. There, Margaret said, dusting off her perfectly manicured hands with the same satisfaction she'd shown after rearranging the flowers I'd brought for Sunday dinner. That takes care of that unfortunate situation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent hit me first. Burning silk mixed with the delicate French lace that had taken months to hand-stitch. It smelled like dreams dying, like the workshop where Abuela Rosa had taken me when I was 12 to show me what real craftsmanship looked like. The flames climbed higher, consuming the pearl buttons one by one, each small pop sending sparks up the chimney like miniature fireworks, celebrating my devastation. Daniel stood beside his mother, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched in that way that made him look like the cowardly boy he'd apparently always been, beneath the man I thought I'd fallen in love with. His brown eyes, the same ones that had looked at me with such tenderness when he'd proposed 18 months ago, now held nothing but guilt and something else. Relief, maybe. As if watching my wedding dress burn had somehow solved a problem he'd been too weak to address himself. "You're not saying anything," Margaret observed, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to make sure everyone understood she held all the power in the room. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual perfect chignon, not a strand out of place, despite having just committed what could only be described as premeditated arson. I expected more of a reaction. I should have been screaming, should have been crying. I should have been grabbing the poker from beside the fireplace and trying to save what was left of the gown that had hung in my closet for 3 weeks like a promise of the future I thought I was walking toward. Instead, I found myself studying the flames with a strange sort of detachment, watching the way the fire consumed the intricate beadwork along the bodice. Each bead had been sewn by hand, tiny crystals that caught the light like captured starlight. Now they were melting into nothing, leaving dark stains on the marble hearth that Margaret would probably spend hours scrubbing away later. The dress was entirely unsuitable, she continued, settling into her favorite wing-backed chair with the satisfaction of someone who had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Far too extravagant for a simple ceremony. People would have talked, Sophia. They would have wondered where a girl like you could have possibly gotten something so presumptuous. A girl like me? The words settled in my chest like stones, heavy and cold. A girl whose grandmother had cleaned houses for wealthy families like Margaret's? A girl who had worked 3 jobs through graduate school to earn her degree in architectural history? A girl who was somehow still not good enough for Margaret's precious son? Despite the fact that I had more education, more ambition, and apparently more backbone than Daniel had ever shown. How I get when I'm upset. As if my perfectly reasonable emotional responses to their months of subtle sabotage and calculated cruelty were character flaws that needed to be managed rather than valid reactions to their toxic behavior. The fire was dying now, the silk and lace reduced to blackened fragments that looked nothing like the masterpiece they had been. I could see the metal boning from the corset, twisted and darkened but still recognizable. The sight of it, the skeleton of my wedding dress lying among the ashes like the remains of some beautiful creature, should have broken my heart. Instead, I felt something else entirely, a curious sort of calm that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside me, the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm breaks. Do you even know what you just destroyed? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time since I'd walked into the room, I saw uncertainty flicker across Margaret's face, just for a moment, before the mask of superiority slid back into place. I destroyed an overpriced dress that would have made you look foolish, she replied, but there was something different in her voice now, something that sounded almost like doubt. I did you a favor, though I don't expect you to see it that way. Not yet. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, finally looking at me directly. Sophia, maybe we should go home and talk about this? Mom just wants what's best for us, for the family. The family. Not our family, not the family we were supposed to be building together, the family that existed only in Margaret's carefully controlled world where I was at best a temporary inconvenience, and at worst, a threat to be eliminated. I looked at both of them, this mother and son duo who had apparently spent weeks planning this moment, who had waited until I brought the dress over for final alterations before striking. The coordination required for this level of betrayal was almost impressive in its cruelty.
"You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steady and strange in my own ears. "I don't see this as a favor, but I do see it for exactly what it is." Margaret's eyebrows drew together in confusion, the first crack in her composure I'd witnessed in the 3 years I'd known her. "And what is that supposed to mean?" I smiled then, and something about the expression must have looked wrong on my face, because Daniel actually took a step backward. "It means," I said, pulling my phone from my purse with hands that surprised me with their steadiness, "that you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The ashes were still warm when Margaret's mask began to slip. She sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by the kind of expensive furniture that whispered rather than spoke its value, watching me with eyes that had gone from triumphant to weary in the span of 30 seconds. The acrid smell of burned silk lingered in the air like an accusation, and I could see her nostrils flare slightly each time she breathed, as if she were just now realizing that some evidence of her sabotage couldn't be easily erased. "I'm not sure what kind of dramatics you think you're going to pull," she said, but her voice lacked the confident authority it had held moments before. "But destroying an expensive dress was hardly a crime. If anything, I saved you from embarrassing yourself in front of the entire congregation." Daniel hovered near the mantelpiece like a guilty child, his hands still buried deep in his pockets. Every few seconds, his gaze would dart to the fireplace, then to my phone, then to his mother's face as if he were trying to gauge just how much trouble he was in based on the shifting dynamics in the room. "I did save you from something," I agreed, scrolling through my photos with deliberate slowness, "though I don't think it's what you intended." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft sounds of the fire settling and the almost imperceptible hum of the grandfather clock in the corner. It was the kind of expensive timepiece that was probably in Margaret's family for generations, the kind that marked time with the quiet confidence of old money and established power. I had always felt small in this room, dwarfed by the weight of tradition and wealth that seemed to seep from every carefully chosen antique. Even the air felt different here, thinner, more rarefied, as if it were a privilege to breathe it. But now, standing amid the ashes of what Margaret had destroyed, I felt something I had never experienced in this house before. I felt like I belonged here. Not because I had earned Margaret's approval, that ship had sailed long ago, but because I had finally stopped seeking it. "Daniel," I said without looking up from my phone, "I need you to answer a question, and I need you to be honest with me, for once." He straightened slightly, and I could see Adam's apple bob in his throat as he swallowed hard. "Okay." Did you know your mother was planning to destroy my wedding dress? The hesitation was answer enough, but I waited anyway, watching the war play out across his features. The part of him that still believed he could somehow salvage this situation battled with the part that was too cowardly to lie outright when confronted with direct evidence of his complicity. We talked about it, he said finally. She was concerned about the dress, about what people would think. She thought maybe if we helped you see that it wasn't appropriate. Helped me see. I repeated the word slowly, tasting each syllable. By burning it. Without my permission, without even asking me where it came from or what it meant to me. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her perfectly applied lipstick creating a hard line across her mouth. What did it mean to you? Sophia, it was a dress. A beautiful dress, I'll admit, but still just a dress. You're acting as if we destroyed some priceless family heirloom. The laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest surprised all three of us. It wasn't bitter or angry. It was the kind of laugh that comes when the universe reveals its sense of irony and all its terrible glory. A family heirloom. Yes, Margaret, I suppose you could call it that. I found the photo I was looking for and turned my phone screen toward them. It was a picture of Abuela Rosa, taken 6 months before she died, standing in the bedroom of her tiny apartment in East LA. She was holding up the wedding dress, her weathered hands gentle against the silk, her face radiant with pride and love. "This is my grandmother," I said quietly, Abuela Rosa. She worked as a seamstress for 60 years, taking in alterations and mending clothes for families who could afford to throw away more in a week than she made in a month. Margaret's face had gone very still, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out where the story was heading and how it might affect her position.
She saved every penny she could spare for 5 years, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. 5 years, Margaret. She ate rice and beans for dinner so she could put $20 here, $50 there, into an envelope she kept hidden in her bedroom closet. Daniel had gone pale, and I could see the beginnings of understanding dawning in his expression. But Margaret was still fighting it, still trying to maintain control of a narrative that was slipping through her fingers like smoke. "That's very touching, Sophia, but I don't see how your grandmother's sacrifices change the fact that the dress was inappropriate for... She bought it from Valentino." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach every corner of Margaret's carefully curated space. "The dress you just burned," I said, my voice perfectly calm now, perfectly clear, was a $47,000 couture gown, the last gift my grandmother ever gave me. She bought it 6 months before she died, using every dollar she had saved over 5 years, because she wanted me to walk into my marriage like the queen she always knew I was. The color drained from Margaret's face so completely that for a moment I thought she might actually faint. Daniel made a sound that might have been a whimper. That's not possible," Margaret whispered. "You couldn't have... Someone like your grandmother couldn't have afforded..." "Someone like my grandmother?" I repeated, and now there was steel in my voice. "You mean someone who worked with her hands? Someone who didn't inherit her wealth? Someone who actually had to earn every dollar she ever spent?" I swiped to the next photo on my phone, the receipt from Valentino, the authentication documents, the insurance appraisal I'd gotten done just last month. The numbers were clear, undeniable, damning. $47,000, I said again, savoring each word, plus tax. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Daniel had slumped against the mantelpiece, one hand pressed to his forehead as if he were trying to hold his skull together. You just burned $47,000, I continued conversationally. But more than that, you burned the last piece of my grandmother I had left. You burned 5 years of her sacrifices. You burned her love letter to my future. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its dignified tone seeming to underscore the magnitude of what had just been revealed. In the fireplace, the ashes stirred slightly in the updraft, and I could swear I caught one last whiff of that distinctive scent, silk and dreams and love, all mixed together and rising up the chimney like a prayer. You didn't just destroy a dress, Margaret, I said softly. You destroyed the most precious thing I owned, the thing that connected me to the woman who raised me, who believed in me, who saved every penny for 5 years so I could have one perfect moment. I paused, watching the realization settle over the both of them like a shroud. But you know what the beautiful thing is? I asked, my smile returning. You thought you were taking away my power. Instead, you just showed me exactly how much I have. The documents on my phone screen glowed like accusations in the sudden silence of Margaret's living room. I watched her face transform as she absorbed the reality of what she had done, watched the imperial confidence crumble into something approaching panic as the number sank in. $47,000. The amount was printed clearly on the insurance appraisal, along with detailed photos of every intricate bead, every hand-sewn detail, every element that had made the gown a masterpiece of couture craftsmanship. This can't be real, she whispered, reaching for my phone with trembling fingers. Let me see that. I pulled the device back, just out of her reach. Oh, it's real, every devastating digit of it. Daniel had gone completely white, beads of sweat forming along his hairline, despite the perfect climate control that kept his mother's house at an eternally comfortable 72 degrees. He was doing the math in his head. I could practically see the calculator running behind his eyes as he tried to figure out what $47,000 meant in terms of insurance claims, legal liability, and his father's inevitable reaction. "Dad's gonna kill us," he said, the words barely audible. "Sophia, please, there has to be some way we can work this out. We can pay for it. We can pay for it?" I laughed again, and the sound seemed to echo off the expensive wallpaper and crystal chandeliers. "Daniel, do you have any idea what you're saying? You want to pay $47,000 to replace an irreplaceable couture gown that was the last gift from my dead grandmother?" Margaret's hands were fluttering now, moving from her perfectly styled hair to her pearl necklace to the arms of her chair, like birds looking for a place to land. The composure she wore like armor was cracking, revealing something desperate and small underneath. "We didn't know. How could we have known? You never said anything about the value, never mentioned—"
I never mentioned it because it wasn't about the money, I interrupted, my voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. The value wasn't in the price tag, Margaret. It was in what it represented. But since you seem to only understand things in terms of dollars and cents, let me break this down for you. I swiped through the photos again, slowly this time, making sure they both saw every detail. The receipt from the Valentino boutique in Beverly Hills, signed by Abuela Rosa and her careful, deliberate handwriting. The authentication certificate from the Fashion Institute. The detailed appraisal I'd gotten for insurance purposes, complete with professional photographs that captured every angle of the gown's exquisite construction. My grandmother walked into that boutique in her best dress, a 20-year-old navy blue suit she'd bought for my high school graduation.
I said, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. She told the salesperson she wanted the most beautiful wedding dress they had, something fit for a princess. When they showed her the price, she didn't flinch. She opened her little white purse and pulled out an envelope filled with 5 years' worth of savings. Margaret made a small, choked sound, but I didn't stop. The salesperson tried to talk her out of it, suggested maybe she'd be more comfortable looking at something in a lower price range. But Abuela Rosa looked her dead in the eye and said, "My granddaughter is worth every penny of this and more. She's going to be a queen, and queens deserve crowns." I could see my grandmother as clearly as if she were standing in the room with us. Her silver hair pinned back with bobby pins, her shoulders straight despite the arthritis that made her fingers ache, her dark eyes blazing with the kind of fierce love that could move mountains or, apparently, buy couture wedding gowns. She spent her entire life savings on that dress. 5 years of setting aside grocery money, of walking instead of taking the bus, of saying no to every little luxury she might have wanted for herself. Also, I could have one perfect moment. The fire had died down to glowing embers now, but the smell of burned silk permeated the room like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. I could see Margaret glancing toward the fireplace with something approaching horror, as if she were just now realizing that the ashes contained the remnants of something irreplaceable. The seamstress who did my final fitting told me it was one of only 3 gowns like it ever made. Hand-sewn French Alençon lace, silk imported from Lyon, pearls that were hand-selected and individually matched. The beadwork alone took 4 months to complete. Daniel was leaning against the mantelpiece now, looking as if he might actually be sick. "Sophia, I'm so sorry. We never would have. If we'd known, if you'd known it was worth a fortune, would that have made it wrong to destroy it?" I stepped closer to him, watching him shrink back. Because the version of the story where it was just a regular dress, where you and your mother thought it was okay to burn something that belonged to me without my permission, that version isn't actually any better. The truth of that statement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He looked at his mother with something approaching accusation in his eyes, as if he were just now realizing that he had been manipulated into participating in something truly awful. "You said it would be simple. You said she'd understand once she saw that we were just trying to help her make better choices." Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. I... we... It was meant to be for the best. The dress was so extravagant, so inappropriate for someone of Sophia's background. "My background," repeated slowly. "The background, you mean the background that includes a grandmother who loved me enough to sacrifice everything she had? The background that taught me the value of hard work and genuine love. The background that apparently produced someone capable of affording and appreciating true craftsmanship, while your background produced someone who destroys precious art out of petty jealousy." I could feel the power shifting in the room, could see it in the way Margaret's shoulders had begun to curl inward, the way Daniel couldn't meet my eyes, the way the very air seemed to be rearranging itself around the truth of what they'd done. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and clear and absolutely final. "You're going to contact your insurance company and report this destruction. You're going to pay the full replacement value, even though we all know this dress can never actually be replaced. And then you're going to stay out of my life forever." "Sophia," Daniel started, reaching toward me with one shaking hand. "Please, we can work this out. We can fix this." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw clearly, for the first time, who he actually was underneath the man I'd thought I was going to marry. He wasn't evil, exactly. He was something worse. He was weak. The kind of weak that would always choose the path of least resistance, that would always side with whoever was strongest in the room, that would sacrifice anyone to avoid confrontation. "No, Daniel," I said gently. "We can't. Because this isn't about the dress anymore. This is about who you are
and who you choose to be when it matters.
Just then, the sound of a car door slamming came from the driveway, followed by footsteps on the front porch. Margaret and Daniel both froze, their faces turning even paler as the implications hit them. Richard was home early from his golf game. "Oh, God," Margaret whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "He can't see this. He can't know what we—" The front door opened, and Richard's was carried through the house with its usual calm authority. "Margaret, what's that smell? Is something burning?" I smiled then, a real smile this time, filled with anticipation rather than pain. "Now this," I said softly, "is going to be interesting." Richard appeared in the doorway of the living room like judgment personified, his silver hair still perfectly combed despite his morning on the golf course, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with the kind of methodical assessment that had made him successful in 40 years of corporate law. He saw Margaret first, pressed back in her chair like a cornered animal, her usual mask of superiority replaced by something approaching terror. Then Daniel, pale and sweating beside the fireplace. Then me, standing in the center of the room with my phone still in my hand and my chin raised in defiance. Finally, his gaze moved to the fireplace itself, where the ashes of my wedding dress lay scattered across the marble hearth like the remains of a funeral pyre. "What?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, "happened here?" But as Margaret began to stammer out some explanation, her words fading into background noise, I found myself somewhere else entirely. The scent of burned silk had triggered something deep in my memory, transporting me across time and space to a small apartment in East LA where the air always smelled of café con leche and the sound of sewing machines hummed like mechanical lullabies. "Mija, ven acá. Come here, my beautiful girl." Abuela Rosa's voice was as clear in my mind as if she were standing beside me, her weathered hands reaching out to draw me into her embrace. I could see her as vividly as if no time had passed at all, her silver hair pinned back with bobby pins that never quite managed to contain all the flyaway strands, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and mischief, her small frame somehow containing enough love to fill an entire universe. The day she showed me the dress was 6 months before she died, though neither of us knew then how little time we had left. I had driven over to her apartment after work, as I did every Thursday, bringing groceries and staying for dinner. But that day was different. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her hands fluttering like birds as she tried to contain whatever secret she was bursting to share. She led me to her tiny bedroom, past the photographs that covered every available surface, pictures of family, of the children she had watched grow up while cleaning their parents' houses, of graduations and quinceañeras, and all the moments that had made up her rich, full life. In the center of the room, hanging from the closet door, was something that took my breath away. The wedding dress seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through her single window, every bead and crystal catching the light like captured stars. The silk was the color of fresh cream, so pure it almost seemed to have its own inner luminescence. And the lace. Oh, the lace was like something from a fairy tale, intricate and delicate and more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. "Abuela?" I whispered, afraid to speak too loudly as if the sound might somehow damage this perfect vision. "What is this? Where did it come from?" She smiled then, the kind of smile that held 60 years of secrets and dreams and quiet victories. "This is for you, mija. For when you marry that boy who makes you laugh the way your grandfather made me laugh." I couldn't touch it at first. It seemed too precious, too perfect, too far beyond anything I could ever deserve. But Abuela Rosa took my hands in hers, those hands that had sewn thousands of alterations, that had scrubbed countless floors, that had counted out her savings penny by penny, and placed them on the silk. "Feel it, mija," she said softly. "This is not just fabric, mija. This is a crown.
This is every dream I ever had for you, woven into silk and lace. The material was softer than I had ever touched, so fine it seemed to move like liquid under my fingertips. Each bead had been hand-sewn with a precision that spoke of countless hours of patient work. And the lace, I could see now that it wasn't machine-made, but crafted by human hands with the skill that was becoming extinct in our modern world. How, was all I can manage to say. Abuela Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, proud tears.
And hoping that someday my beautiful granddaughter would have a wedding day worthy of a princess. I started to protest. It was too much, too expensive. She couldn't have spent her savings on something so extravagant for me. But she placed a finger against my lips, silencing my objections with the gentle authority she had always possessed. "Listen to me, Sophia Elena," she said, using my full name the way she did when she wanted to make sure I understood something important. I worked my whole life cleaning other people's houses, sewing other people's clothes, watching other people's children grow up in beautiful homes while I lived in this little apartment. But none of that matters because I had you. I had my brilliant, beautiful granddaughter who was going to college, who was going to have a career, who was going to marry for love instead of necessity. She reached up and touched my face, her palm warm against my cheek. "This dress is not about the money, mija. This dress is about showing the world that you belong wherever you choose to be, that you are worthy of the finest things life has to offer, that you carry with you the love and dreams of everyone who came before you." I was crying then, unable to stop the tears that came from somewhere so deep inside me I hadn't even known they existed. But what if it's too much? What if people think— "Let them think," she interrupted fiercely. "Let them wonder how a girl like you could have something so beautiful. Let them question and whisper and make their assumptions, and then let them see you walk down that aisle like the queen you are, wearing the crown that love built." She stepped back and looked at the dress, then at me, her expression filled with such fierce pride that I felt my spine straighten involuntarily. "They will try to make you small, mija. The world will try to convince you that you don't deserve beautiful things, that you should be grateful for scraps instead of demanding the feast you have earned. But this dress will remind you of who you really are. This dress will remind you that you are the granddaughter of Rosa Esperanza Reyes, who came to this country with nothing but dreams and built a life worth living through sheer force of will." The memory was so vivid, I could almost smell the café con leche that was always brewing in her little kitchen, and I could almost hear the telenovelas playing softly on her ancient television. But the acrid scent of burned silk brought me crashing back to the present, to Margaret's living room where my grandmother's final gift lay in ashes on the marble hearth. "And you thought you could erase her," I said softly, the words barely more than a whisper, but somehow carrying across the room with perfect clarity. Richard, Margaret, and Daniel all turned to look at me, their faces confused by my apparent non sequitur. But I could see Abuela Rosa as clearly as if she were standing beside me, her dark eyes blazing with the same fierce pride she had shown that day in her bedroom. "You thought by destroying her dress, you could make me forget who I am," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You thought you could burn away the love that built that gown, stitch by stitch, penny by penny, dream by dream." Margaret made a small, choked sound, but I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was looking at the ashes in the fireplace, at the twisted remains of what had once been the most beautiful thing I'd ever owned. "But you can't burn love," I said, and my voice was Abuela Rosa's voice now, filled with the same quiet authority, the same unshakable conviction.
You can't destroy dreams. You can't erase the woman who raised me to know my own worth." I looked up at them then, and I could see in their faces that something fundamental had shifted. The victim they had expected to find broken and grateful was nowhere to be found. In her place stood Rosa Esperanza Reyes's granddaughter, wearing her inheritance of strength like the crown it had always been. "She's still here," I said, touching my chest where I could feel my heart beating strong and steady. "She's in every lesson she taught me about dignity, about worth, about never letting anyone convince me I deserve less than everything I've earned." The room was absolutely silent, except for the soft ticking of Richard's expensive clock and the almost inaudible sound of the last embers dying in the fireplace. "So thank you," I said, my smile returning as I looked at Margaret's stricken face. "Thank you for showing me exactly who you are, and thank you for reminding me exactly who I am." Richard's question hung in the air like smoke, waiting for an answer that seemed to cause Daniel physical pain to provide. I watched my fiancé, though even thinking that word now felt strange and distant, struggled with the simple task of explaining what had happened, his face cycling through expressions of guilt, panic, and something that looked remarkably like the petulant anger of a child who'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said finally, his voice cracking on the words. "Mom just we thought that maybe if Sophia saw that the dress wasn't appropriate, she'd understand that we were trying to help her make better choices for the wedding." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, and I could see him realizing how thin his justification was when spoken out loud in front of his father. Richard's expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had gone very cold, very still, in a way that reminded me of the moments before a storm breaks.
"You burned her wedding dress?" Richard said quietly. "You destroyed something that belonged to her without her permission, without her knowledge, and you're calling it helping?" "Dad, you don't understand how expensive it was," Daniel said, desperation creeping into his voice. $47,000 for one dress. What would people think? What would they say about our family if she walked down the aisle in something so... "So what?" Richard interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now. "So beautiful? So well made? So clearly chosen with love and care?" Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. So inappropriate for someone of her background." The words fell into the room like stones, and I could see Richard's face change in real time. The careful mask of professional composure he always wore cracked, revealing something raw and angry underneath. "Her background," he repeated slowly. "You mean the background that produced a woman with a master's degree in architectural history, the background that raised someone intelligent enough to build a successful career, compassionate enough to care for her elderly grandmother, and strong enough to put up with your mother's treatment for 3 years without complaint?" Margaret made a small sound from her chair, but Richard silenced her with a look. "Or perhaps you mean the background that taught her to appreciate craftsmanship and beauty, the background that valued love over money and sacrifice over selfishness." His voice was rising now, though he was clearly fighting to maintain control. "Because if that's the background you're criticizing, then I suggest you take a long, hard look at your own." Daniel was visibly shrinking, his shoulders hunching inward as if he could make himself disappear. "Dad, that's not... I didn't..." "What did you mean, Daniel?" Richard asked, and his voice was deadly quiet now. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your mother conspired to destroy something precious that belonged to the woman you claim to love, and you're trying to justify it by attacking her family, her grandmother, and her worth as a person." I found myself studying Daniel's face as his father spoke, searching for some sign of the man I'd thought I was going to marry 18 months ago. Somewhere in there, buried under the weakness and the panic and the desperate need to avoid responsibility,
Was there still a trace of the person who had proposed to me 18 months ago? The person who had once told me he loved my independence, my passion for my work, and my refusal to be intimidated by his family's wealth and status. "It's not like that," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We were trying to protect her from embarrassment. The dress was so much. People would have talked." "Let me get this straight," Richard said, his lawyer's instincts clearly kicking in as he began to pace the length of the room. "You were protecting her by burning her property. You were saving her from embarrassment by destroying something she treasured. You were helping her by taking away her choice, her agency, and her right to decide what she wanted to wear on her own wedding day." With each point Richard made, Daniel seemed to sink deeper into himself. I could see the moment when he realized that every justification he and Margaret had constructed was crumbling under the weight of logic and basic human decency. "And now," Richard continued, "after learning that this dress was worth $47,000, your primary concern seems to be about money and reputation rather than the fact that you've destroyed something irreplaceable." "That's not true," Daniel protested, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "I feel terrible about what happened to Sophia's grandmother's gift. I really do. But Dad, $47,000! Do you understand what this could do to our family if she decides to sue? What could it do to your practice, to Mom's standing in the community?" And there it was, the moment I had unconsciously waiting for, the final proof of who Daniel really was when everything else was stripped away. Not a man concerned about my pain or grief, not someone wrestling with the magnitude of the cruelty he participated in. He was worried about lawsuits and reputation and what this might cost his family financially. Richard stopped pacing and turned to look at his son with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It was a disappointment so profound it seemed to age him 10 years in the span of a single breath. "Get out," he said quietly. Daniel blinked, clearly not understanding. "What?" "Get out of this house. Now. Before I say something I'll regret." "Dad, you can't be serious. This is my home. We need to figure out how to handle this situation." "The situation," Richard said, his voice cutting through Daniel's protest like a blade, "is that my son has revealed himself to be someone I don't recognize. Someone who would destroy a priceless heirloom belonging to the woman he claimed to love and then worry more about the financial consequences than the emotional devastation he's caused." Margaret finally found her voice. "Richard, you're overreacting. Daniel made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can pay for the dress, make it right."
"Make it right?" Richard turned on his wife with the same cold fury he'd directed at their son. "Margaret, you burned a dead woman's final gift to her granddaughter. You destroyed something that can never be replaced, never be recovered, never be made whole again. There is no making this right." The room fell into silence, except for the soft sound of Daniel's ragged breathing and the persistent ticking of the grandfather clock. I watched the three of them, this family that had never truly accepted me, as they faced the consequences of their choices for the first time. "Sophia?" Richard said, turning to me with something that looked like profound sadness in his eyes. "I owe you an apology, not just for what they did, but for not seeing sooner what kind of people they really are, for not protecting you from this." I looked at him, this man who had always been polite to me, but distant, who had never interfered when his wife made her cutting remarks or his son failed to defend me. He was offering me something now that felt like recognition, like respect, like the acknowledgement I had been unconsciously craving for 3 years. But it was too late. Much too late. "Thank you, Richard," I said quietly, "but I don't need protection anymore. I think I'm finally ready to protect myself." Daniel was staring at me now with something approaching panic in his eyes, as if he were just beginning to understand that this wasn't something that could be smoothed over with apologies and promises to do better. "Sophia, please," he said, reaching toward me with one shaking hand. "We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can—" "No," I said simply. "We can't."
The finality in my voice seemed to echo through the room, bouncing off the expensive wallpaper and crystal chandeliers like a decree that couldn't be appealed or overturned. I was done. Finally, completely, irrevocably done. The silence that followed my refusal stretched like a taut wire through Margaret's living room, humming with tension that seemed ready to snap at any moment. I could see Daniel processing my words, searching my face for some sign that this was just another argument we could resolve with time and apologies. But whatever he saw there made him take a step backward. "You can't mean that," he said, his voice thin and desperate. "Sophia, we've been together for 3 years. We're supposed to get married in 6 weeks. You can't throw all of that away because of one mistake." "One mistake." I repeated the words slowly, tasting the bitter irony of them. "Is that really what you think this was?" I pulled my phone from my purse again, but this time I scrolled to a different folder, one I'd been building for months without even fully understanding why. Call it intuition, or maybe just the survival instinct of a woman who had learned to document everything when dealing with people who had mastered the art of gaslighting. "Richard," I said, not taking my eyes off Daniel's increasingly panicked face, "would you like to see what one mistake actually looks like when it's part of a pattern?" Richard moved closer, his expression curious and wary. Margaret had gone very still in her chair, like a predator who had suddenly realized she might be the prey. "This is from 3 weeks ago," I said, holding up my phone so Richard could see the screen. It was a screenshot of a text message from Margaret, sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night when she knew I'd be asleep, probably hoping I wouldn't see it until morning when I'd be rushing to get ready for work. "The flowers you chose for the centerpieces are completely inappropriate. I've taken the liberty of changing the order to something more suitable. A bride should know better than to pick such gaudy arrangements. I suppose we can't expect someone from your background to understand subtlety." Richard's eyebrows drew together as he read, and I swiped to the next screenshot. "I've spoken to the caterer about reducing the number of vegetarian options. Most of our guests have more refined palates than what you're used to serving. Please don't embarrass the family by insisting on keeping those ethnic dishes on the menu." "Margaret," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made her wife straighten in her chair. "Richard, those messages were taken out of context. I was just trying to help plan a wedding that would be appropriate for our social circle. Someone had to provide guidance." There are 47 more messages like this. 47. Would you like to see them all, or should I skip to the really special ones? I swiped through the screenshots, each one a small cruelty designed to chip away at my confidence, my choices, my sense of belonging. Messages about my dress being too revealing for church, about my family being too loud at the engagement party, about my career being an amusing hobby that I'd obviously give up once I was married.
"This one's from last month," I said, stopping at a particularly vicious text that had arrived the morning after I'd gotten a promotion at work. "I hope you don't expect Daniel to move to accommodate your little job. A wife's place is supporting her husband's career, not chasing her own selfish ambitions." Richard's face was growing darker with each message, but I wasn't done. I swiped to a different folder, one that had required more careful planning to create. "And these," I said, holding up a series of bank statements, "show that I've paid for 68% of our wedding expenses. The venue, the photographer, the band, most of the catering, even the flowers that Margaret decided were too ethnic for her taste." Daniel's face went ashen. "Sophia, that's not... We always planned to split the costs." "Did we?" I asked, opening another screenshot. "Because this email from you, sent 2 months ago, says something different." The email was brief but damning. "Mom thinks it's weird that you keep offering to pay for stuff. Most brides' families cover the wedding costs. And if your family can't afford it, maybe we should scale things back to something more in your price range." "I never sent that," Daniel said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your email address says otherwise.
I turned the phone toward Richard, letting him see the full header information that clearly showed the message had come from Daniel's account. Along with this lovely follow-up, where you suggested I ask my grandmother for money, since she probably had some savings tucked away somewhere. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Margaret's sharp intake of breath, could see Richard's hands clenching into fists at his sides, could watch Daniel's face crumple as he realized that his carefully constructed version of events was falling apart under the weight of documented evidence. "But the real masterpiece," I said, opening a voice recording app on my phone, "is this conversation I recorded 3 days ago when I got home early from work and heard you two talking in the kitchen." I pressed play, and Daniel's voice filled the room, tinny but clear through the phone's speaker. "I still think burning the dress is too extreme, Mom. What if she finds out we planned this? She won't find out anything because you're not going to tell her. And even if she suspects something, what can she do? By the time she realizes what happened, it'll be too late to do anything about it. Besides, once she sees how much better she looks in something more appropriate, she'll thank us." "But what if she doesn't? What if she gets upset?" "Then you comfort her and help her see that we only want what's best for the family. Daniel, your father and I didn't sacrifice everything to build this life so you could marry someone who doesn't understand how to fit in. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, but I stopped it there. The damage was already done. Daniel looked like he was about to vomit, Margaret had gone completely white, and Richard was staring at his wife and son as if he'd never seen them before. 3 days ago," I said, quietly. "You've been planning this for at least 3 days. Probably longer, but that's just what I managed to record." Richard turned to his son with an expression that was equal parts disgust and disappointment. "You recorded this conversation?" "I've been recording conversations for 2 months, ever since I started to suspect that things weren't quite adding up. Did you know your wife has been telling people at the country club that I'm a gold digger who trapped your son with a pregnancy scare? Or that she's been spreading rumors that my grandmother's funeral was overly dramatic and culturally inappropriate for the church we held it in?" Margaret made a choking sound, her hand flying to her throat as if she were trying to physically hold back the words that wanted to escape. "I have recordings, screenshots, bank statements, and witness statements from 3 different vendors who heard Margaret making disparaging comments about my family. I have documentation of harassment, financial manipulation, and now destruction of property worth $47,000. I looked at each of them in turn. Daniel with his guilt and panic, Margaret with her shock and fear, Richard with his growing understanding of just how deep this betrayal went. "So when you call this one mistake," I said to Daniel, "what you really mean is the one mistake that finally got us caught." Richard was quiet for a long moment, his lawyer's mind clearly working through the implications of everything I'd just presented. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled but underlaid with the fury that seemed to vibrate through his words. "Margaret," he said without looking at his wife, "I want you to pack a bag and go stay with your sister. Tonight." "Richard, you can't be serious."
And Daniel, he continued, cutting off her protest, "you need to find somewhere else to live, immediately." "Dad, please, we can work this out." "No," Richard said firmly, "we can't. Because this isn't about the money or the dress or even the lies. This is about who you've chosen to be, both of you." He turned to me then, and I could see something like respect in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. "Sophia," he said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you don't mind. There are some things I need to say and some things I think you need to hear." The silence that followed Richard's words felt different from all the others that had filled this room today. This wasn't the stunned quiet of people caught in their lies or the heavy pause of consequences being calculated. This was the silence of a man who had spent decades keeping his own counsel, watching and weighing, and finally reaching a verdict that would change everything. Margaret found her voice first, her composure cracking completely. "Richard, you can't mean this. I'm your wife. Daniel is your son. You can't choose her over your own family." Richard turned to look at his wife with eyes that held 40 years of accumulated disappointment. "My family," he said quietly, "would never have done what you did today." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach every corner of the room. I watched Daniel's face crumple as he realized that his father, the man whose approval he'd spent his entire life seeking, was looking at him with something approaching disgust. "Dad, please," Daniel tried again, his voice breaking. "We can fix this. We can make it right. Just tell us how to make it right." "You want to know how to make it right?" Richard asked, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You can start by acknowledging what you really did here, not to a dress, not to an object, but to a person. To someone who trusted you, who loved you, who believed you when you promised to protect and cherish her." He began to pace again, his lawyer's instincts taking over as he built his case. "For 3 years, I've watched my wife systematically tear down a remarkable woman with subtle cruelty and calculated humiliation. And you," he turned to Daniel, "you stood by and let it happen. Worse than that, you participated." Margaret tried to interrupt, but Richard held up a hand that silenced her more effectively than shouting could have. "I've listened to the recordings, Margaret. I've seen the bank statements. I've read the messages." His voice was gaining momentum now, decades of suppressed frustration finally finding their voice. "For months, you've been telling me that Sophia was difficult, demanding, and ungrateful. You painted her as someone trying to take advantage of our family's generosity." He stopped pacing and fixed his wife with a stare that could have cut glass. "But the evidence tells a different story, doesn't it? It tells the story of a woman who paid for most of her own wedding while being told she was a gold digger. A woman who endured months of harassment while being called difficult. A woman whose final gift from her dying grandmother was destroyed by people who thought they knew better than love itself." I could see Margaret shrinking in her chair, all her imperial confidence evaporating under her husband's steady gaze. This was a side of Richard I'd never seen, not the politely distant father-in-law, but the formidable attorney who had built his reputation on dismantling lies with surgical precision. "And you want to know the worst part?" he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I let it happen. I saw what she was going through, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I chose the easy path of neutrality while someone I should have protected suffered alone." Daniel was crying now, ugly tears that made his face blotchy and desperate. "Dad, I love her. I really do love her. I didn't know how to stand up to Mom. I thought if I could just keep the peace until after the wedding." "Until after the wedding what?" Richard demanded. "Until you could trap her in a marriage where she'd have even less power to defend herself? Until she was legally bound to a family that had already proven they would never accept her?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see Daniel realizing that his father had seen through all his self-deception to the ugly truth underneath. "I want both of you out of this house," Richard said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel, "this night. I need time to think about what kind of man stays married to someone capable of such cruelty, and what kind of father raises a son who would participate in it." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been physically struck. "You can't mean this. Where am I supposed to go? What will people think?" "People will think exactly what they should think," Richard replied coldly. "Those actions have consequences, even for people who have spent their lives believing they were above them." He turned to me then, and his expression softened into something that looked like genuine regret. "Sophia, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you stay for a few minutes after they've gone? There are some things I need to say to you. Things I should have said a long time ago."
I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Something was shifting inside me. Not just the end of my relationship with Daniel, but the end of something larger. The end of trying to earn acceptance from people who would never offer it. The end of making myself small to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. "Thank you," Richard said quietly. Then he looked at his wife and son, his expression hardening again. "You have 1 hour to pack and leave. After that, you can communicate through attorneys." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but something in her husband's face stopped her. For the first time in the 3 years I'd known her, she looked truly powerless, truly defeated. As they stumbled toward the stairs, Daniel turned back one last time, his eyes pleading, "Sophia, please, don't let this be how we end." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. Not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of profound clarity that felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream. "Daniel," I said gently, "this isn't how we end. This is how we began. With your mother's cruelty and your refusal to stop it. I'm just finally seeing it clearly." He opened his mouth to argue, but I shook my head. "We ended the moment you decided she was more important than I was. Everything since then has just been me figuring that out." Lena's apartment smelled like vanilla candles and fresh coffee, a stark contrast to the acrid scent of burned silk that seemed to cling to my clothes like smoke from a fire I couldn't escape. I sat curled on her oversized couch, wrapped in the fuzzy throw blanket she'd tucked around me the moment I'd walked through her door, still shaking from the adrenaline of the day's revelations. "So let me get this straight," Lena said, pacing her small living room with the same energy she brought to everything else in life. "Your future mother-in-law burned your wedding dress, your grandmother's $47,000 wedding dress, and your spineless fiancé just stood there and watched it happen?" I nodded, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when I spoke. "It gets better. They recorded themselves planning it. I have evidence of months of harassment, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse." Lena stopped pacing and turned to stare at me, her expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked like fierce pride. "Please tell me you're pressing charges. Please tell me you're taking them for everything they're worth." "Richard threw them both out," I said, taking a sip of the tea she'd pressed into my hands. "Margaret and Daniel. He told them to communicate through lawyers from now on." "Good for Richard." Lena settled into the chair across from me, her dark eyes intense. "But what are you going to do? Because please tell me you're not having second thoughts about walking away from this disaster." The question should have been harder to answer. 3 years of my life, a planned wedding, a future I'd been building one careful step at a time, all of it gone in the span of a few hours. I should have been devastated, lost, wondering how I was going to rebuild everything from scratch. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. "I'm going to divorce him," and the words felt like taking a deep breath after being underwater too long. "I'm going to take them to court for the dress, and I'm going to start over." Lena's face lit up with the kind of smile that could power a small city. Thank God! I was starting to think I'd have to stage an intervention. "You never liked Daniel," I said, though it wasn't really a question. Lena had been diplomatically supportive for 3 years, but I could see now that her enthusiasm had always been carefully manufactured. "I didn't like what he was doing to you," she corrected gently. "You used to be this force of nature, Soph. You'd walk into a room and everyone would look up because you had this presence, this confidence. And then you started dating him, and it was like watching someone slowly disappear." The truth of her words hit me harder than I had expected. When did I stop believing in my own opinions? When had I started second-guessing every choice, every outfit, every word that came out of my mouth? Her mother made me feel like I was never enough, like I was always one mistake away from proving that I didn't belong in their world.
Bullshit! Lena's voice was fierce, protective. You have 2 degrees, a successful career, and more class in your little finger than Margaret has in her entire body. You never needed to prove you belonged anywhere. You just needed to stop trying to belong somewhere that didn't deserve you. I felt tears threatening, but they weren't the tears of grief I'd expected. They were tears of recognition, of finally seeing something clearly that had been obscured for too long. The dress was the last thing she gave me, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Abuela Rosa saved for 5 years to buy me that dress, and they burned it like it was nothing.
Lena moved to sit beside me on the couch, her arm wrapping around my shoulders in a hug that felt like coming home. They didn't burn your grandmother's love, Soph. They can't. That's still here. She pressed her hand over my heart. And it always will be. But the dress was silk and lace and thread, Lena interrupted firmly. Beautiful, yes, precious, absolutely, but not as precious as the woman your grandmother raised, not as valuable as the strength she gave you. They thought by destroying the dress they could make you smaller, more manageable. Instead, they just freed you from people who were never going to appreciate who you really are. I leaned into her warmth, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully. I'm scared, I admitted. I don't know how to start over. I don't know who I am without this relationship, without this future I was planning. Yours, Sophia Elena Reyes, Lena said firmly. You're the granddaughter of a woman who came to this country with nothing and built a life through sheer determination. You're someone who pays 68% of her own wedding costs and doesn't complain. You're someone who documents evidence of abuse instead of just accepting it. You're someone strong enough to walk away from a $47,000 mistake even when it hurts. She pulled back to look at me directly, her expression intense. You're not starting over, Soph. You're finally starting to be yourself again. As if to punctuate her words, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it, expecting spam or maybe one of Daniel's friends trying to play mediator. Instead, I saw Richard's name. I've spoken with my attorney about your situation. Can you meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m.? There are some things we need to discuss about making this right. Richard. I showed the text to Lena, who raised an eyebrow. Making it right? I guess we'll find out, I said. But the first time since I'd walked into Margaret's living room that morning, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. The law offices of Morrison, Blackwell, and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city that seemed to stretch on forever. I sat across from Patricia Morrison, Richard's longtime colleague and one of the most formidable family attorneys in the state, watching her review the evidence I'd compiled with the kind of focused intensity that probably made opposing counsel break out in cold sweats. This is remarkably thorough, Patricia said, looking up from her tablet where she'd been scrolling through screenshots of Margaret's messages. Most people don't think to document harassment this systematically. It's going to make our job significantly easier. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Richard had introduced us an hour ago, explaining that he'd retained her services on my behalf, a gesture that had surprised me more than I'd let on. The destruction of property charges is straightforward, she continued, making notes on her legal pad. With the appraisal documentation and witness statements, we can easily establish the $47,000 value, but the harassment case is what's going to make this really expensive for them. How expensive? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Patricia smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. California takes emotional distress very seriously, particularly when there's documented evidence of systematic harassment targeting someone's background and cultural heritage. Between the property destruction, the harassment, and the financial manipulation you've documented, we're looking at potentially significant damages. She pulled out another folder, this one containing papers I recognized as divorce documents. Richard asked me to prepare these as well. Given the evidence of your husband's participation in the harassment and destruction of property, we can file on grounds of cruelty and irreconcilable differences. The fact that you've documented paying for most of the wedding expenses works in our favor for asset division.
The words should have felt overwhelming, lawyers and lawsuits and legal proceedings that would drag this mess out for months. Instead, they felt like vindication, like someone finally taking seriously what I'd endured. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, reaching for an envelope that had been sitting on her desk. "Richard asked me to give this to you." The envelope was heavy, expensive paper with my name written across the front in Richard's careful handwriting. Inside was a check that made me gasp, and handwritten note on his personal letterhead. "Sophia, your grandmother was right. You deserve to wear a crown. This isn't payment for what was destroyed because what my wife and son took from you can never truly be replaced. This is an investment in your future, in the life you choose to build, free from people who never deserve to be part of it."
I should have protected you from them years ago. I should have seen what they were doing and put a stop to it. My silence made me complicit in their cruelty, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Use this money however you see fit. A new home, a fresh start, or simply the security of knowing you never have to depend on anyone who would treat you as less than the remarkable woman you are. You have my deepest respect and my sincerest apologies. Richard. The check was for $100,000. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, trying to process what this meant. Not just the money, though that was staggering, but what it represented. Recognition. Validation. And acknowledgement that what I'd suffered was real, was wrong, was worth making right. "He feels terrible about what happened," Patricia said gently, watching my reaction. "About his role in allowing it to continue for so long. This is his way of trying to balance the scales." "But why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't owe me anything." "He seems to think he owes you 3 years of peace of mind. 3 years of being treated with the respect you should have received as part of his family. He can't give you back those years, but he can make sure your future is secure." I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was overreacting to Margaret's comments, if I was being too sensitive, if I should just try harder to fit into a world that seemed determined to reject me. All the times I'd second-guessed myself, made myself smaller, accepted less than I deserved because I'd been convinced that was the price of belonging. "What happens now?" I asked. Patricia's smile was sharper this time, predatory. "Now we file the paperwork. The divorce petition, the civil suit for destruction of property and harassment, and a restraining order to keep them from contacting you during the proceedings. By the end of the week, they'll understand that their actions have consequences." She gathered the documents into neat piles, her movements efficient and purposeful. "I should warn you, they'll probably try to settle out of court once they realize how much this is going to cost them. Margaret's already facing potential charges for destruction of property, and Daniel's looking at being held liable for both the harassment and his participation in planning the destruction of your dress." "Good," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "Let them face consequences for once." As I walked out of the law office, the afternoon sun streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not in someone else's world trying to earn acceptance I'd never receive, but in my own life, finally ready to claim it fully. The elevator descended toward the lobby, carrying me away from lawyers and legal proceedings back toward the life I was going to build. A life where my grandmother's love wasn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. A life where $47,000 was just the beginning of what I was worth, not the sum total of it. A life where I finally understood that I had never needed anyone's permission to be remarkable. The doors opened onto the marble lobby, and I walked out into the sunlight of my future, finally free. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the International Conference on Architectural Preservation, delivering my keynote address to an audience of 500 professionals. My new apartment's keys felt solid in my pocket, a space that was entirely mine, filled with light and my grandmother's photographs. The settlement had been generous,
Margaret and Daniel learned that Kroji has a price tag they couldn't afford to ignore. But as I spoke about preserving what matters most, I thought of Abuela Rosa and smiled. They'd burned silk and lace, thinking they could make me smaller. Instead, they'd set me free to wear the only crown that ever mattered, the one love built that no fire could ever destroy.